coming here, where I am now, to Spain, where I worked again as a teacher trainer, both on pre-service courses and in-service courses. Plus doing a lot of seminars, workshops and things, and then moving into the kind of area of conferences, local conferences, international conferences, conferences for publishers, before then moving into a master's program at a university based in the United States, where my training continued more or less online, teaching teachers online. And that's more or less where I am now. I'm just going to check that you are following. We've lost Maha, but
hello, Scott.
Can you still hear me?
Can you hear me? Hello, Scott.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm Aya. So we can hear you quite well.
Good. So I'll continue.
Yeah, yeah. So that was so good. So maybe you can move to the second question until Maha gets back in.
Sure.
Yeah. So is there anything you would like to add before we move to the second question?
Just let me check my brief here. What was the second question?
Oh, yes. I'd be
writing. Okay, writing.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, writing was a natural extension of training. And I was asked to write a book for trainers. Well, I was asked to write course books originally by colleagues I was at university with when I did my master's at Reading. They were looking for a co-writer. And so I got into writing workbooks, course books, etc. And it wasn't until 1995 or something I was approached by a publisher to write teacher training material. So I wrote a book called About Language for Cambridge University Press, which is a book of language analysis tasks. And one thing led to another. I wrote a number of books for Pearson, Longman Pearson, in the how-to series, how to teach grammar, how to teach vocabulary, how to teach speaking. And then I gravitated into, well, I was offered the chance to become an editor.
Yeah, that was great.
By Cambridge, of the handbook series, which is a very long-standing and popular series of methodology books that goes back 40 years, actually. We were going to celebrate our 40th anniversary in IATEFL this year.
Wow, that's so good.
But I wasn't the editor for all those 40 years. I took over in 2005, I think, and have been editing books ever since. And I'm very pleased to say that the books still prove very popular, and we have a number of books that are in production at the moment, very exciting projects in our pocket books series, and which you may well know, I've actually written a book in the series, but Penny wrote a book in the series.
Yes.
We have a new book coming out on teaching young learners in the series, another one on teaching teenage learners in the series. So it's all moving ahead. So a lot of my work now is involved in editing for that series. So as I say, it's been very much a kind of evolutionary process of starting off teaching, moving into mentoring within an institution, then into training, formal training, then into writing, and now into lecturing and so on, and now into editing.
Yeah, so
and
it's
more
like
writing, I hope, too.
Yeah, like the natural evolving of the.
Well, I mean, I was incredibly lucky. I grew up when English language teaching was growing up. If you think about it, I mean, in the 1970s, when I was first trained, it was a relatively young profession, and it was relatively easy to get a foot in the door, especially if you were a white native speaking male. All doors were open to you, and I mean, it's not the same now, and quite rightfully it shouldn't be the same. the privileges that I was able to take advantage of should now be extended to a much broader range of people, including women, of course, who make up the bulk of English language teachers, but also non-native speaking teachers in peripheral, if you like, context, not from the kind of the big centers, if you were. But that's another story.
Oh, yes.
And which role do you like best, Scott?
Well, Maha, the role I loved was teaching. And if I hadn't liked teaching, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now. And I've been lucky enough to work with teachers, practicing teachers, all through this process. But my connection with the classroom is kind of secondhand, in the sense that I watch teachers teaching, I talk to teachers about teaching, I go to conferences where people are talking about teaching, but I don't do any actual classroom teaching myself, or I haven't for a while, although I did have an experience last year in Russia where I was asked to teach a group of teenagers without any preparation, 30 of them with their teachers watching, and that was kind of that was an exciting experience. That was a real, what they call seat of your pants experience, or white knuckle experience, where you're hanging on so tightly that your knuckles turn white. But it was it was wonderful to be back in the classroom again. So, but I mean, no, I like writing because I think what I do, not many other people do, in the sense I'm not an academic. And I'm not just writing practical ideas for teachers. I'm somehow kind of in between. So I see myself as a kind of mediator role. So I read the academic literature, the research literature, which I find very interesting. And then I kind of like reinterpret it, if you like, for practicing teachers, because they're too busy, they don't have time, or they don't have access to these academic papers, etc. So I see that as quite an important role. And I enjoy doing that, and I enjoy the contact I have with teachers, particularly online like this, but also actually something I didn't mention, but I kept a blog for about 2 or 3 years, which was also very interactive and a different kind of writing with immediate feedback. And that I like as well. So I'm, you know, I mean, I'm very grateful for the opportunity like this to be able to talk to teachers all around the world, especially now that I can't travel all around the world. So again, you know, that's something I like doing a lot. Karima just asked a question. Can I answer Karima's question? She says, do I do any research?
Sure.
No, you see, because I'm not really a researcher, and that's one role that I haven't really taken on board. Not that I don't like research. I read a lot of research, and I respect people who have got the time, the trouble, and the energy to do research. I interpret other people's research, which is a form of research in a sense. I mean, you know, that's my research. It's reading those books, reading the journals, keeping up to date, and then interpreting it for practicing language teachers. So research is perhaps the one big kind of hole in my experience. I mean, I did do, on my master's course, I did some research. Clearly you had to. And I've done soft research in the form of questionnaires, etc. But nothing quantitative, nothing what you would call hard research, if such a thing exists in the social sciences. Maha, any more questions? Thank you, Karima.
Yes, yes, and how did you? I'm sorry because my internet was cut and then I came back. Maybe you answered this one. How did you started adding your different ideas about communicative English language teaching, introducing it to the world of English language teaching? How did you do that?
Well, yes, I didn't answer that question, so thank you for asking me. If you recall then the dates that I'm talking about, when I started teaching, when I was initially trained, 1975, 1976, I moved to Egypt, the methodology that was the default setting, if you like, at the time, the standard methodology was what I call late audiolingualism. And it was very much focused on teaching patterns and drilling patterns and focus on accuracy and focus on a structural syllabus. And then there was the shift occurred. The shift occurred in the mid-1970s when there was the movement away from structuralism, away from audiolingualism, towards a more communicative approach where the emphasis moved from accuracy onto fluency, from drilling onto role plays, dialogues, information gap activities, all that kind of thing. So there's a huge transition, quite a major one really in the history of English language teaching. Nothing had happened like that since the end of the 19th century, when the movement into the direct method. So it was a major shift. Now, the news took a while to arrive to Egypt, where I was teaching. And in fact, it wasn't until I went back to London I can't remember, 1979, I think I did my diploma course, that the impact of the communicative approach really set in. And I found it very exciting because I'd been frustrated by this method that I'd been trained in, this late audiolingualism. I found it very, it was technically easy to master and not unpleasant, but it was frustrating because you could see the frustration of the students these were Egyptians in they were very keen to learn English and didn't want to have to spend a year being drilled in the present continuous. So I recognized that frustration. And so when these new methods started to appear, it wasn't just the communicative approach, it was the humanistic movement at the same time, the influence of Stephen Crash and all sorts of things were going on, very exciting. It came at the right time for me, and I changed my whole approach and my whole attitude to methodology. And that has, in a sense, stayed with me ever since. And I don't want to go into all the details here, but, we saw those of us who were experienced that initial change and welcomed it, were very frustrated 10 years later when there was a kind of the pendulum swung back again from fluency back to accuracy, from functions back to structures, etc. And I saw it as my kind of purpose in life to try and retrieve some of those principles of the communicative approach, because I do think that they were very important. And I don't think they were just a Western or a European or an Anglo kind of construct. I think they did work in Egypt and they can work all around the world, because after all, language is not an abstract system that you learn like mathematics and then apply. Abstract is a living thing that people use for social and communicative purposes, and it stands to reason that those social and communicative purposes should be central to any methodology that purports to teach the language. So and that's what the communicative approach was all about. So I wanted to rescue the communicative approach, and that has been my sort of drive. I mean, that doesn't mean to say I don't see flaws in the communicative approach, and I think it's, there's so many different contexts in which English or second languages are learned, that we can't obviously impose one method on the whole world. We have to, it has to be adaptable to the context in which it is being learned. But I think, again, the communicative approach does have the advantage of being an approach. It's very elastic. As people endlessly have tried to point out, it's not just about role plays and information gap activities. So I do think it's adaptable, and I do think it's worth returning to or reviewing periodically, because I don't think there's anything better, at the moment on offer. So it seems to me it's not the best language teaching method in the world necessarily, especially for online, for example, teaching, but it is the one we've got, and we should make the most of it.
Yes. So what do you think of the idea which is going into fashion nowadays of the flipped classroom? People started encouraging this idea some time ago, but nowadays, because we are online and it's a chance to have the students to work online, so they started encouraging teachers to use this idea. What do you think of it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a buzzword, the flipped classroom. I think classrooms have always been flipped in the sense that some learning goes on in the class and then some learning goes on outside the class. We used to call it homework, and it came after the lesson, but there was no reason why you couldn't do preparation before the lesson. And I think, teachers have always been doing that. They'd say, read this, and they would talk about it in the lesson, or learn these words and would use them in the lesson. I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think it's just become a big thing because of the possibilities offered by online delivery. So now, of course, it's perfectly possible to say to your class, I want you to watch this YouTube or this TED talk before the lesson, and then we'll talk about it during the lesson. I think that's great because, I mean, I think actually watching videos in classrooms or listening to audio recordings in classrooms or even reading in classrooms is not ideal. Classrooms are noisy, hot, often uncomfortable places. It's better if you can do the reading or the listening or the viewing in the comfort of your own home with your headphones, etc., and then use the classroom, the physical classroom, for what it's really good at, which is the kind of social interaction, the speaking, if you like, the speaking and the real listening. So, I mean, I have zero problems with the idea of the flipped classroom or blended learning. And of course, now more than ever, this is the model that's been, in a sense, we've been precipitated into. If those of us who are not using online resources before the crisis, of course, are now having to learn how to use those resources very, very quickly. And that's, I mean, that anticipates your question, Maha, about coping with the crisis, but I'll let you ask the question.
Okay, but I have a very an itching question that I would like to ask before I move to the next one. How did you go ahead in parallel with Jeremy Harmer during that time? How did you work together?
Jeremy and I have known each other for a very long time because we met on the conference circuit. In fact, I think we first met here in Spain at a conference we were traveling to from Barcelona, and he was then somebody I had enormous respect for because he'd written a number of very important books on methodology. He was a big name, and he forgot my name instantly, but he had the humility to apologize next time he saw me, and we've been friends ever since. And it was he who invited me to write the 3 books I wrote for the how-to series, how to teach grammar, how to teach speaking, etc., because he was the series editor at the time. And so we had a close professional cooperation. And then subsequently, we taught together on the same master's program in New York, both online and on site. And so, and we've been, of course, to conferences. We coincide, we used to, before the crisis, a lot. And so, yes, so in fact, I just got an email from Jeremy today with encouraging news about a new project. So we're still working together.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And this takes us from this idea of the communicative language learning and the flipped classroom to the next question about teachers. How do you advise novice teachers and pre-service teachers to go ahead during this time of crisis?
Well, that's a difficult one, Maha, because I mean, as we were saying before the meeting started, when we were chatting, the different countries are experiencing the crisis in different ways and at different stages. In some countries, they're already, the kids are coming back to the classroom. I have a colleague here who teaches Spanish, and she's been teaching online, and now her school said, no, you can come back now. We're having classrooms again, because this is for adults, but people want classrooms. And it will happen at different rates and different contexts. I think where it will happen first is in primary, because primary is the greatest need for classroom teachers, and parents simply cannot cope with the demands of remote teaching at home, particularly if they are working themselves. Whereas secondary school, university, the students hopefully have a little bit more ability to work on their own. I mean, not all of them, of course, but as I was saying before, in a sense, we were kind of semi-prepared for this because a lot of us had been using online resources, such as in the flipped classroom or blended learning approach, or at least, you know, we were familiar with some of the websites that are available, some of the resources like YouTube, obviously, and TED Talks and things like that. What we weren't familiar with was direct online teaching using Zoom, Skype, Microsoft Teams, and all that kind of thing now. And it's been a very fast learning curve for a lot of teachers. And I think that's an experience that will stand them in good stead. When they go back to the classroom, they'll find that, yes, these tools are actually quite useful for maintaining contact with learners, presumably in various combinations of the flipped model that you were talking about before. But I mean, I think teachers have always coped with crises, actually. Teachers as a profession are incredibly resilient. And I mean, I'm thinking of some of the teachers I've met, for example, in places like Palestine, who are working under very difficult conditions outside the classroom, just simply getting to work and getting home again, but manage to maintain an extraordinarily positive morale. And what keeps them going is the pleasure and the importance of the job that they're doing. And similarly, teachers who, you know that I'm a trustee for the Hands Up project, which works directly with teachers, mainly in Gaza, who have been in a crisis for the last 10 years, you could say 60, 70 years. And yet those teachers, I've met them, I've been there, I've talked to them, they're fantastic. They are a lesson to all of us in terms of how teachers cope with the most extraordinarily difficult conditions. And what the Hands Up project does is simply uses very, very accessible, free online tools like Zoom, like Skype, to bring people from the outside world, outside of Gaza, into their classrooms to do storytelling, plays, games, etc. And this has been going on now for 3 or 4 or 5 years, the Hands Up project. That's the kind of thing that we can learn from. This is how teachers really... And another project I'm involved in is working with refugees in Jordan, adult refugees, mainly from Sudan, Somalia, etc., who are trying to get into higher education, and working with a charity trust called Mosaic, and bringing lessons to teachers via WhatsApp. That's it, WhatsApp. Everybody's got a phone, everybody got access to WhatsApp, and that's it. Lessons via WhatsApp, and they're communicating with each other, they're forming groups, they're teaching each other, they're accessing materials, etc. Now, this is coping in crisis conditions which preceded the pandemic, preceded the coronavirus. But this is what teachers do. This is what students do. The hunger for education is so intense that it means that people are incredibly resilient and incredibly resourceful. Now, I'm not underestimating the problems that teachers are facing at all. I know many teachers here in Spain, which is relatively well off, who have been without work for the last 3 months, and without permanent contracts, and without any hope of getting back to work, without being able to pay their rent, etc. I mean, you know, it's been a disaster for very many teachers. On the other hand, many teachers have used this opportunity to upskill or reskill themselves very quickly using these kinds of tools that I'm talking about, and becoming, I think, from what I gather, very, very competent online teachers. Hopefully not forever. And one of the other things that I think we need to be careful of and beware of is the possibility that institutions and ministries might take advantage of the fact that all this online teaching has been going on and say, oh yeah, carry on, we'll close the classrooms. Classrooms are expensive, teachers are expensive, we'll do it from home from now on. And this is happening at the tertiary level, very much so. In universities, we're seeing it. They're closing down their universities, their campuses, and they're moving to 100% online, at least for the short term. And now how long that will last, I don't know. But it seems to be a cynical taking advantage of the fact that, yes, okay, we've got these tools, we've got the means to teach online, but it's not the best way of learning. That, especially languages. Languages are situated. They are physical. They are embodied. They are social. And to be able to learn a language, you need to be in the physical place where the language is being used a lot of the time. So this is my fear, that the situation, the crisis will be exploited at the expense of the good old-fashioned language classroom.
Okay, so keep the rest of this for the last question. Because we have an important question. Maybe they are somehow mixed together between this idea and the last question. It's about your plenary speech, which you gave in Brighton in 2016. You mentioned that L.G. Kelly you quoted him saying the place of grammar in the learning process has never been really clear. For even when the tide has been running in a certain direction, some teachers have always tried the opposite. So do you believe that nowadays is the time for the application of such a quote?
Yes, thank you, Maha. Yes, in fact, actually, the quotation about grammar teaching comes from this marvelous book that's long out of print called 25 Centuries of Language Teaching, written in 1969. So, I mean, it's not a new book, but he makes that point that attitudes to teaching grammar are like, it's that pendulum again. They've swung backwards and forwards over these 25 centuries. People saying grammar is a good thing. You've got to teach it. It's absolutely essential. It's the backbone of the language. You can't learn a language without learning the grammar rules. Other people saying, no, that's nonsense. Look at the way we learned our first language. We can just learn it by picking it up, by, it's what Krashen would call acquisition and so on. So that argument has been going backwards and forwards. And what Kelly is saying in this book is that, in fact, but there'll always be teachers who will be running in the opposite direction. Whatever is the reigning paradigm, if you like, whether it's direct method or communicative approach or audiolingualism or whatever, there'll always be those maverick teachers who'll be doing their own thing. And I like that. I mean, I think the wonderful thing about teaching is that once you close the door, you can kind of do quite a lot of experimenting. And I think the best teachers are the ones who do close the door and saying, I think I'm going to just try a lesson where I don't speak, or I'm just going to try a lesson where I stand at the back of the room instead of at the blackboard, or I'm going to try a lesson where I don't use any translation or whatever. Teachers have always been doing that, and teachers have always been aware that there's more than, we have this expression in English, it's a terrible expression, but there's more than one way to skin a cat. I don't know where it comes from, but there's more than one way to teach the present perfect continuous, and that's great. So we should be experimenting. I mean, obviously, your context means that you will be more or less free to experiment. Some teachers have much less freedom than others. And of course, there's the exams and the syllabus and the inspector and the headmaster and the parents, everybody kind of breathing down your neck. But once that door is closed, you can, I think, take little risks and see how it feels. And the students, nobody's going to die just because you taught the present perfect continuous in a different way.
Yeah, they are not going to die. Yes, we need to be inventive or rather creative if we are allowed to use the usual word. Yes, we have to be creative, and each teacher has to have his or her touch. So we need to give the teachers more freedom, or ask the teachers to be more courageous. They are inside the class. I usually tell the teachers, the class is your kingdom. So whenever you get inside, rule it the way you like, so long as you're teaching.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes. So this takes us to the question which has been going around all around the world nowadays. What do you think of the future of education?
Oh, well, I don't I don't do predictions, because people who do predictions always end up with egg on their face. There's another good idiom. That is to say, who would have predicted the COVID crisis, for example? I mean, a year ago, I was on a panel and people were saying, what's the future of education? People were going, oh, it's going to be this, it's going to be this, it's going to be this. In fact, I was on a panel in February in Saudi Arabia, and we were asked those questions. What's the future of education? This was in February. Nobody had any idea that everything was going to be closed down, including in Saudi Arabia. So, it's very dangerous to make predictions. I would certainly, I would make warnings, and that's the warning I made before, a warning to resist the temptation to move everything online. I hope that doesn't become a prediction. I won't make any predictions about technology, because, who would have thought in 2004 there'd be such a thing as YouTube, even, I mean, or Facebook or whatever. I mean, these things have happened in the last 10, 15 years. Things move very quickly, but they don't actually change education in any fundamental way, particularly language education. Nobody's found a way yet of learning a language successfully, for example, by taking a pill, or by listening to audio recordings while you're asleep. I mean, it still requires guidance, whether by a teacher or by a sibling or a peer or a parent or whatever. And it requires opportunities for use through speaking and writing and listening and reading. And those things haven't changed. We can do them differently now. We can read online, we can listen to lots of material online, etc. That's fantastic. But there's still a lot of things that classrooms, old-fashioned classrooms, do very, very well. And there's still a lot of things that teachers do very well. And one of them is they give feedback to learners, and learners need feedback. We don't learn anything without feedback. And there's no machine yet in the world, no app, no software, no magical technological innovation which is able to give the kind of feedback that learners need, because there's no app yet that knows what learners are trying to say. But teachers know what learners are trying to say, and they know how to say it better. And that's why teachers are so well placed to help learners grow as language users.
Yeah. So you do not support the idea that technology is going to replace teachers?
Not at all. No, not at all.
Because many people have been worried about this.
It will replace the teachers who are themselves kind of on autopilot, if it were. But if teachers do what we were talking about before, continually experiment, reflect, develop, attend online webinars like this, read, do research themselves in their own classrooms, then no computer is going to replace them. You can take my word for it.
I will take it for sure. Yes. Thank you very much, Scott. It has been a pleasure having this quick talk with you, and we have a number of questions for you coming from Zoom and the Facebook. The very first one, it's rather like a comment. Communicative approach, implementation, will also depend on the social context of the learners, right?
Yes.
Shall I say it again?
No, no, the social context, yes. I mean, one of the things that another reason why the communicative approach, in a sense, was well grounded was because it came out of sociolinguistics, not out of pure linguistics or psycholinguistics. It had a very strong social base. I mean, the original term communicative competence was coined by a linguist called Del Hymes, who was a sociolinguist in the days when that expression was very, very new. And he understood that language is socially and contextually sensitive, and that and therefore the learning of it needs to be sensitive to the social. And of course, then there's another tradition which arrived late in Western method or pedagogy, which was the socio-cultural tradition, which came from then Soviet Russia and the work of Lev Vygotsky. So that whole theory of learning, which situated all learning within its social context, that you learn through interaction with people who are a little bit better than you. That theory was late to arrive in the West because of it was associated with Marxism, but now it's very much the flavor of the month. And the socio-cultural theory really was the kind of the learning theory that the communicative approach lacked initially. Remember, the communicative approach developed out of a theory of language, about language functions, language uses, etc. There wasn't a theory of learning associated with it. That came later. But the theory of learning is very much one which situates learning in its social context of use. And of course, there are other people I could mention in passing, like Michael Halliday, etc., who very much fed into that tradition. So that's another reason not to lose sight of the communicative approach, because it is centered on the social functions of language. Maha, you've gone cold on me.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, but yeah, my sound is going and going. It's cracking for me. Yeah. Any questions on Facebook? Any questions? Facebook, anyone on Zoom? Any more questions? Yes. Yes, Maggie. Yes. Would you pose your question, please? Would you like to open the mic and ask Scott right away? You can unmute yourself. Maggie? Shall I unmute you?
Yes. Okay. That's just gonna take a minute. I'm sorry for that.
Yes.
That's way better. Okay. I'm actually preparing my Delta Module 1, and I'm just asking for recommendation. Like, what should I do? I feel like a little bit lost here. I already taught the how to teach IELTS course and TOEFL, and I've been teaching for 5 years now. So when it comes to Delta, it's a little bit a challenge, you know. So I was just asking, you know.
Good question. I mean, I used to teach on the Delta when it was called the D-TEFLA, and it wasn't in modularized like it is now. But I don't feel 100% confidence to talk about its present manifestation. But the things that, it depends how you're doing it. I mean, if you're doing it completely online, or if you're doing it with a group, or if you're doing it in chunks, etc. I mean, it can change the modality significantly. I know that from having taught a master's course both online and face to face, and that it's a different kind of experience. But you're a lot luckier now, I think, than I was when I did it, because when I did the Delta, when I was a student on the Delta, or the D-TEFLA, whatever it was called, we only had books. I mean, I love books, but I mean, books were hard to get. And I was in Egypt, and there was no Amazon or anything, clearly. Now, of course, there's so much you can read online, and I think, and not only that, so much is written by other teachers who are doing or have done similar courses. So blogs, you know, I wouldn't want to recommend mine exclusively. There's a lot of other good blogs out there, but it's reading, so that you kind of open your eyes to all the different possibilities, and also so that you understand the kind of theoretical. I mean, the wonderful thing about the Delta is that it supplies the kind of theoretical basis to teaching, which the earlier courses like the Celton don't really have, because they really are, you know, toolbox kind of courses. They're to get you up and running, but they don't give you the kind of theoretical grounding, the principles. And so that's what you need with the Delta, particularly. So, I mean, you know, you could do worse than read.
Okay. Thank you very much. We have three questions over here. One of them says, I would like to thank you, Scott, for your teaching unplugged method. I have used it in my classes. It was very successful and the students liked it too. But how can we adapt it online?
Yeah, good question. They're actually, yeah, how can I answer this simply? I think it depends if you're teaching a group or one-to-one for a start, obviously. It's easier to adapt one-to-one teaching as it is in on-site or face-to-face. If you've got one student in front of you, there's, you know, teaching unplugged is the only option, it seems to me, because unless you direct your teaching at that particular learner's needs, then you're going to fail that learner. And so, but it's much harder when you've got a whole classroom of learners, and how do you adjust your teaching to each of those individuals? And the same is exactly the same online. I mean, the principle underpinning the dogma approach is that it's really the strong form of the communicative approach. And again, the dogma approach grew out of my commitment to communicative language teaching and the idea that you learn a language by using it. Now, there's no contradiction between learning a language by using it in a classroom and learning a language by using it online. Yeah, but you're just using it. Yeah, the learning, the use comes from the learners, and it's not so difficult to set up activities online where learners are actually using language creatively and taking some initiative. In fact, one of the books I edited for Cambridge, which came out last year or a year or two before, was Interaction Online by Lindsay Clanfield and Jill Hadfield. And that's just a whole book of activities for online learning. Now, these are perfectly compatible with a dogma approach. They don't require a great deal of materials. And the idea is that they encourage learners to produce language, which then the teacher can provide some feedback on. So I don't see a big problem. I mean, yeah, online learning is harder and teaching is harder than on-site in many ways, in most ways, but it's not incompatible with teaching using few resources apart from the language that's generated in the conversations between the teacher and the students, or between the students and each other.
Okay. Another question, it says, all theorizers of ELT are currently insisting on authenticity of teaching. How can we adopt it in the classroom environment? Authenticity.
Well, authenticity is a difficult term because it's got so many different meanings. And when we talk about authentic materials, that is to say materials that weren't purpose written for classrooms, and of course there's a huge, massive supply of those now, thanks to the internet, of authentic text, but they're not without their problems, as teachers know, who've tried to use texts which are too difficult for learners. I have no problem with texts which have been specifically written for learners, particularly at lower levels, just as I have no problem with graded readers, for example. You can't read, you know, Dickens' Great Expectations in the original until you're at C1 level. So, but you can get the pleasure from a lot of the story of it at B1 level by reading a graded reader. So I'm not one of these people who maintains authenticity for the sake of authenticity. But that's authentic materials. Authenticity as a notion in terms of classroom interaction is a slightly different thing. And I guess what that means is that if you're trying to create authenticity in the classroom, you're trying to create a culture, a classroom culture, which replicates how language is used outside the classroom. That is to say, everything that goes on in the classroom will be authentic language use, which in a sense is a kind of principle underlying the dogma teaching unplugged approach to a certain extent, although we've never made authenticity a kind of key tenet of dogma approach. There are people who argue that you cannot have authenticity in the classroom. Classrooms are by their very nature particular environments where you can't, that they are different from the outside world. That's why people go to them, because they are different. They have a whole different social structure, and the language that's generated in classrooms is different from the language which is generated in the street or at home, or, so I'm not, also, I don't subscribe to that. These are the people who say, oh, you can't have real conversations in the classroom. But I mean, I think anybody who's a teacher, who's been a teacher for any length of time will say, yeah, that's not true. I've had real conversations in the classroom. I've had real conversations with 6-year-olds in the classroom. I've had real conversations with 60-year-olds. You can have a degree of authenticity in the classroom. And I guess what dogma is trying to say is maybe we could encourage a bit more of that authenticity and then use those conversations as kind of material for language focus. What's so crazy about that? And maybe those conversations, which are about things that are real, will be more memorable and will generate more learning opportunities than those conversations which are artificial and are simply people using language for display purposes.
Okay. Another question, which is a bit complicated. I will try to mix it because they gave me the question in the form of 3 questions. Someone says she's Ghada, and it seems that she is a supervisor. And she says, how does it feel, or how would you react if you walk into a class and find out that the teacher is doing everything you are against, even though it pays off sometimes?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's happened to me. It happened to me as a director of studies in the school in Cairo when we had a new teacher who had experience. He'd come in, and I was observing his class, and everything he was doing ran counter to everything I'd been trained to do. And it was a vocabulary lesson, and he was just like, hang on, now, this is all wrong. I didn't tell him, but I was thinking, this is all wrong. But I couldn't help noticing how engaged the learners were, how they were, they were sitting on the edge of their seats. So there was this big contradiction. He was doing something that was clearly not orthodox. At the same time, he had the learner's attention. So I had to kind of change the chip. I think, hang on. It's not his problem, it's my problem. I need to become more flexible. I need to open up, because what's going on here is working in the sense the learners are engaged. They will come back, they want more of this. And so, so then I have to think, now what is it? What principle that I'm ignoring here validates what this teacher has just been doing? And that's when this is coming back to Maji's point, this is when you need to look at the literature and say, well, hang on, I need to look at the literature about engagement, or I need to look at the literature about attention, or I need to look at the literature about vocabulary learning to understand what's going on here. So I don't think, I would be surprised if I walked into a classroom and saw something which so shocked and horrified me that I had nothing but a negative reaction. I think you can learn something from any classroom, even if you think, well, that teacher could be, you know, he's not, he could be a little bit more effective. It's my job as a trainer to suggest ways in which, but I mean, you know, teaching, unless you're actually physically beating the children, teaching doesn't do any irreparable damage. There's good teachers and there's not so good teachers, but the not so good teachers are not doing anything that's actually criminal, one hopes. And so I have to leave. This is what, who was it? Diane Larson Freeman refers to as, the doubting self. That you always have to, you mustn't, no, I've got it wrong, but it's a kind of, you need to learn, especially as a trainer, to be less closed, yeah, more open to all the kinds of things that go on in classrooms. And you also need to watch the students to see how they're reacting, because after all, at the end of the day, they're the ones who will judge or not how effective a teacher is.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Some question here is about the best methods of assessment. Best methods of assessment.
Oh, assessment. Well, I always use the analogy of an athlete. If you have to assess, you've got two athletes, two runners, and you want to evaluate how good they are at running. You could submit them to a whole battery of different kinds of tests, testing their their body weight, their muscle density, their heart rate, their blood pressure, their lung capacity. And that way you could get a kind of idea of which of the two was more likely to win a race. That would be one method. Yeah, so you break it all down into all the different components and you measure each thing separately. The other method would be you take your two runners and you say to them, you see that tree over there? Now run. And the one who gets there first is the best runner. So that's the difference between, if you like, what we could call discrete item testing, testing all the little bits, the grammar, the vocabulary, the pronunciation, the reading, the writing, the speaking, etc. Or performance testing, where you test the performance. You give the learners a task to do and you see how well they do it. Now, it's much more difficult to measure performance in language than it is to measure performance in running, but it's not impossible. And this is something that people have been working on for years now, performance assessment, holistic assessment, etc. And that's, I think, the kind of assessment which would be more compatible with the methodology that I think is the one I'm invested in, which is a more communicative task-based approach. I mean, a task-based approach, you know, you're teaching through tasks and you test through tasks. It's not rocket science.
Mm-hmm. There is a question here coming up from Hind. How can I ensure everybody is engaged in an online class of 30 students? And this goes on with another question about how to control online teaching, or how could learning online be more controlled?
Wow. How can you keep everybody engaged in class 30 students with great difficulty? And that's why, you know, this is why online learning will never replace classroom learning, because it's harder to keep them engaged. I mean, if I had an answer to that, I would be a millionaire. There is no answer. There is no answer.
What do you think of the idea of the break rooms? Do you like this idea?
The idea of?
The break rooms.
Well, I don't know, Maha. Actually, I haven't had enough experience. What I've been learning about breakout rooms is that they're difficult to supervise.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yes.
group work has always been problematic in classrooms with large numbers because, you know, you're monitoring one group and the other group are over here talking in Arabic about their last weekend. But, you know, you can see that they're not on task. In a breakout room online, it's very difficult to see. I don't know. I mean, maybe there's technology which allows you now to see what's going on everywhere. And I've been reading about people being very inventive with tasks to make sure that, you know, everybody in their different room is responsible, accountable. You know, if you have to report back to the rest of the class after the breakout room, then hopefully you will stay on task longer than if there's no report back. So if you're going to put students into breakout rooms, say, and when we come back, I want you to tell us what you were doing and what you discovered. Yeah, and that might keep them engaged. But you know, don't ask me.
You know, I have experienced this, but of course with trainers, we were on some kind of discussion group, and we had these break rooms, and we had to write down to agree on some points, and then we have to report them back in the end. But I think it can be also the teacher has the right to get into these break rooms, so the teacher can go around the break rooms, check what's going on, and then come back again to the main room.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we're on a very, there's a lot to be learned about teaching online and teaching groups online, particularly when they're all in different locations. And we're still learning. And we're still learning how to do this, what I'm doing now. I mean, every time I do a session on Zoom, I'm working harder to keep your attention than I might be if I was in the classroom. I mean, can you see that? Can you see that I'm trying to get your attention? This is what you have to do online. You have to reach out and you have to grab them and say, listen to me, I'm talking to you, I'm your teacher.
Yes. Thank you very much, Scott. I would like to end this section of the questions with a very interesting comment. This comment came from Ghada, again, the one who asked you about the teacher in the class who is doing everything against what you have asked her to do. She says, I'm resisting the urge to ask you, to ask him means you, how it feels to be you, Thornbury. But I decided to refrain from that, knowing how humble and modest he is.
Well, sweet. Thank you, Ghada. Humble is not humble is not in my vocabulary. It's very sweet.
I really resisted the urge to do that, knowing that you're totally against that, but I have to give it to you. I mean, like, wow, how to feel to be so influential, being Thornbury himself. I mean, yeah.
Takes two to tango, Ghada. If I didn't have the Maha Hassans of the world who invite me to do this, then I would be a nobody. It's people like Maha you should be thanking, not me.
Thank you very much. It's you whom we are supposed to thank. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for your time, for your expertise, and for being with us for over an hour now. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Maha. Thank you, everybody. Good night, wherever you are.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Hope to see you. Stay safe.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. See you. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here with us today. It has been a pleasure. I hope you enjoyed the talk. And inshallah, on Sunday, we are going to have the third guest of the talk series is Jason Anderson. He's again a writer and a trainer and a material writer, and he is so full of interactive ideas that can be used in class. So hope to see you again on Sunday, and remember to register down again once more. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maha. That was really enjoyed. Thank you very much. We enjoyed every bit of it.
Thank you very much.
So much.
Thank you very much, Reda, and thank you everybody, and thank you for your collaboration over here. Thank you very much. Hi, Judy, how are you?
Good to see you, Ma.
Thank you for your comments, Judy. Thank you. It has been a pleasure having you with us today.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I was running late doing multitasking. Anyway.
So what time is it over there?
It's like 3:20 in the afternoon, but I've got like 4 meetings that wanted me all on at the same time. Like, there's a limit. Anyway, it's good to see you. I'm glad I did get to see Scott. I was having trouble with trying to do different devices.
And as usual, it's the internet and the technology again once more, which is causing us lots of
Always.
troubles. Yeah,
Fun
yeah,
stuff.
it's
Anyway,
pleasure to see
see
you.
you guys.
See you. See you. Bye. Thank you, everybody. See you.